Yeah. Oh. Don't want that, do we?
Yes, I love it.
Let's unmute there. Okay, we're going to make this work somehow. Welcome to seminar. Like I said, are there any announcements from IPSO or anyone? Jennifer, you have something?
Yeah, we have soup today. It's gonna be really good. And after soup today, we have our white elephant gift exchange party. So stick around for that. And also on the last day of class, December 9th, we have waffle breakfast for you. So we're gonna have all the toppings. We're gonna be making waffles from 8 until noon. So come by and get a free waffle on your last day of class and celebrate a great semester.
Waffles are a cool part of the department, guys. So hope that you'll make it. Come on up to campus. If you don't normally come up to campus, come get something to eat.
With today's soup, we have some mini Christmas tree
You guys are wonderful in person. Any other announcements that we have for anything? We hope that you'll join us in person next week for seminar. It sounds like the speaker has some things that will be better done in person, from what we understand. And so again, take a trip up to campus next week and you'll get some soup along with that as well.
Presenter again.
His name is
Stephen Behanen.
Stephen Behanen.
He came in like a month ago to seminar, so some of you might have talked to him. He's really cool. He sounds like he has some funky things planned that'll be an experience that is best had in person, for sure.
So hope you see you next week, and that will be the last seminar of the semester. And this week I am presenting. So I'm going to present some of my research. This is a study called Objectivation, Design Team Conversation. If you're interested, the QR code takes you to the article itself. I'll throw the QR code up again on the last slide as well. Just so so you don't have to worry about trying to grab it now. The intent of this study was to try to get at least partially down to the bottom of this question: what is design? And when you look at design literature, there's kind of two ways that this question is addressed. The first focuses on what scholars call external representations of design. And so this is what it looks like to an outside observer, people watching the designers, or maybe even the designer themselves when they are stepping back and reflecting on their own process. And so these external representations, they tend to focus on specialized methods. They tend to focus on the processes, the techniques, the models, the tools, and so on. But this is only one of the ways that design can be represented. The other, you could probably guess, is called the internal representations. And this tries to pay attention to what is it like actually during design itself, not from someone on the outside looking in, but someone from the inside looking in, right? While they're actually designing, while they're actually improvisationally solving problems, while they're embedded in complex situations, what are the acts of seeing, saying, and doing, or the situated actions that they're involved in? And this is a really fascinating set of findings. It's a pretty robust body of literature I'll spend some time with today. And it ends up being a pretty strong critique of the external representations. So what's wrong with the external representations? Well, they focus so much on the methods and the processes and what the observer sees that they miss almost everything else, right? They say design must be this process. And so if we can't describe it in terms of this process, we'll either redefine it so it can fit in the process, or we'll just ignore it. And that tends to actually strip out most of what's really, really interesting when you watch people do what people do. And so these internal studies, these internal representations, they've come from a tradition started in sociology in the earlier part of the 20th century. It culminated with a scholar named Harold Garfinkel. And what this tradition says is when we're studying people's action, right? Lots of times the finding will be, well, the person did what they did because they were socialized into the rules of their culture, right? They were conditioned by their culture to do things a certain way. And Garfinkel and others said, wait a minute, you haven't explained anything if that's your explanation. All you've done is you've kicked the can down the road, right? Because what does it mean to socialize someone into the rules of a culture? What does it mean to condition them to respond to what a culture says that they should do? And so Garfinkel and others said that what really needs to be explained are not these structures, like in our conversation today, the structures of design or the processes of design. That doesn't need to be explained because those aren't explanations of anything. What needs to be explained are the fundamental interactions that makes being human. So here's an example. If I come over here and say, can you hand me that? Sure.
Okay.
Lindsay handed me her mask, right? And that's a pretty sophisticated interpretation on her part, as well as all of your parts, right? I come over here and I say, can you hand me that? And Scott knew from the back of the room, I wasn't talking to him. Right? He didn't jump up and come running up here to do anything with me. Neither did any of you, right? Also, I asked a question, right? Can you hand me that? Mackenzie understood it as a request or an instruction. And even though I didn't say the word mask, she figured out, based on the gesture I made, that I was talking about the mask, right? So that's pretty sophisticated to figure all of those things out. And so out of this tradition of research, people like Harold Garfinkel said, those are the things that are interesting to talk about. Those are the things that are really, really interesting to explain. Not the structures we build on top of it. The structures don't even exist. Right? There's no such thing in the world called, enculturation. There's no such thing in the world called design thinking, right? Those are just labels we give other types of interactions, other types of processes in which we engage. And if we strip out the really interesting things that are going on in those interactions, we're missing most of what it means to be a human being. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? And so this study that I engaged in was out of that tradition to try to pay more attention to these internal representations, the actual interactions that are going on in design itself. One person talking about this as like good jazz, social interaction is artfully made up on the spot from available resources rather than following prescribed rules. And then Ben Matthews, who spent a lot of time studying design in this space, has concluded design processes have a milder effect than is typically assumed and do not easily account for the designer's activities. So some examples of this, when you look at people making design decisions, this study, a research team led by Campbell a couple of years ago concluded when you actually watch decision-making happen, you never can identify the moment of decision. No one in that interaction can clearly identify a decision happened here. Decisions just happen. Lots of interactions that we'll actually be talking about a little bit as part of the presentation today. Arlene Oak did a study of design dilemmas where people were encountering challenges in their design processes. And she saw that often people don't really articulate the dilemmas that they encounter because there's a bias for agreement in those conversations. No one wants to be the one who appears disagreeable. So people allude to dilemmas, they drop hints about them, but they never really stop to say, hey, guys, we have a problem here. And sometimes we do, right? These aren't universal laws. These are just patterns that we sometimes see in interactions. Heinemann, another design research team, also found a similar finding that there is such a bias to agreement in these kinds of interactions that even someone who suggests something, as soon as it becomes clear that everyone else is going to disagree, they'll flip, right? They'll start collaborating in the destruction of their own idea so they don't appear disagreeable to their colleagues. So these are really interesting findings, really interesting things that we miss completely. We're just looking for, oh, did they follow this step? And then what did they do after they followed that step? And what did they do after they followed that step of design processes? Now, I imagine that some of you are probably have a question in your mind now. So I'm going to make that question explicit. You're saying, but Jason, aren't you the guy who teaches us design processes? And the answer to that is yes, I am. So some of you are maybe imagining this being me at home, just wondering what my life is all about. That's a great question. And I'm not going to answer that question now. We're going to address it throughout the presentation. So keep that question in your head. It's a great question, but we need to, I think, explore this study a little bit more before going into that particular question. Okay, so the title of the presentation was Objectivation. So I should probably talk about what that term means before actually describing the study itself. So out of this tradition of research, it's called ethnomethodology, is a technical name of this tradition of research. They try to identify and give names to these different kinds of interactions. And a very pervasive kind of interaction in human behavior is what they call objectivation, where we take really abstract things that we're talking about and we turn them into objects through our talk, through our conversation, sometimes through even physical actions like sketching or drawing or modeling different things. So we turn our thinking into objects that we can use to organize the situation. So a good example of this is when we give a name to an abstract concept, or when we create a rule, right? That's taking a really abstract thing and summarizing it down with something that has a label attached to it, right? And it's not a metaphor. Like, we treat these things like objects. We treat them as real as if we're working with a chair or talking about a chair. We talk about these really abstract things as if they really have a materiality. And this is a pervasive finding in ethnomethodological research. It really is something that comes up again and again and again and again. It really seems to be a pretty fundamental pattern of human interactions. So the process of this, we offer an account of our thinking. It's confirmed by others. We treat those accounts as facts, and then we give those accounts an authority that exists apart from the rules, or apart from the interaction, excuse me. And a great way to see this is in some studies that some scholars have done about playing board games. So all of you know who played board games that, like, the official rules only cover a tiny part of what it takes to actually get the game done, right? A big one is what happens if the dice falls on the floor, right? Most of the time that isn't accounted for in the rules, right? Nor do you as human beings. You're not very consistent about it either, right? It depends in those situations, what happens? Well, it depends on the group you're with. It depends on the floor, like if it's fuzzy carpet versus hardwood floor, right? How far does the dice roll away? Do you have to hunt for it? Is there opportunities for people to cheat? Like, all of those things, you have to figure those things out in the moment when you're playing games. And so they've done studies where they put video cameras in a room where people are playing games and just watch what happens. And often what happens is the first time the dice falls on the floor, someone says, "What do we do now?" And someone will say, they'll probably give it a name. "Keep it on the table, man." Everyone kind of gets a sense of what that means. Keep it on the table, man, means we have to re-roll the dice. Sometimes people will verbally assent. They might agree. Sometimes they'll agree, they'll confirm that account by the person who rolled the dice picking it up and rolling it again, right? That's a form of agreement. What happens then later on in the game? Someone drops the dice again, and it's a really favorable roll, and they start arguing about it. Someone says, "No, you can't do that. No, you got to re-roll that." What doesn't happen? What doesn't happen is when they're challenged, no one says the rules were ambiguous. And so to allow us to make progress in the game, we decided that we were just going to follow this pattern, right? No one says that. People say, what? You can't do that. The rules say you can't do that, right? Keep it on the table, man. They refer back to this rule that they created themselves as a way to keep order in the process of playing the game. Of course they could change it. Like, who says they can't change it? Of course they can change it. But they don't, because they have this bias towards order, bias towards the system that their own objects, their own behaviors have already set up to maintain that, so they can maintain order in their lives. Let me pause here before I go into the study itself and ask, are there any questions, comments about anything? Tanner?
Your example of rolling the die is like a rule by which people need to decide whether they'll live or not. You know, it's something that divides good behavior from bad, you could say. But does objectivation also refer to like the description or the definition of a heuristic?
Yes.
Even though that's not like a rule we have to live by, a description of patterns, but that's also objectivation.
Yes, that's true. That is true. Good.
Okay,
There's a
so-
fact from the chat. Echo.
Yeah, the first question is depression an example of this then?
So this is a good question. So the phenomenon that we experience of where we can't get out of bed, where we, everything looks gloomy to us, like that's a real phenomenon, right? That's something that really does happen to us. But bundling a set of symptoms together and calling it depression, and then treating that group of symptoms together as a fact, yes, that's an example of objectivation. And in other cultures, they group symptoms differently, right? So you go to some cultures and the things that we call depression, they might call 2 or 3 different conditions of our lives because they group those things a little bit different way.
Okay. And then the next question is, do you think that objectivation, is bad then? Like, no, it's not
It
bad.
just is, right? So it could be good, it could be bad. It just is. Just like agreeing with each other, it is, right? We just agree. And sometimes agreement is good, sometimes agreement is bad. Depends on what you're agreeing for, and why you're agreeing, and who's agreeing, and under what conditions, and what happens next, and those kinds of things. But
I was intrigued by the parenthetical social amnesia.
Yeah.
Explain that, please.
yeah, so that's what, again, I've referred to this scholar, Harold Garfinkel, a few times. That's what he called it, is there's this amnesia that takes place when we've created these rules or given names to concepts where we forget that we just created it. So like the example of, we act like we forget, like whether we forget or not, who knows, but we act like we forgot, like the example of the game I just gave. No one goes back and says, wait, no, we decided we can't do that. They typically go back and say, the rules say you can't do that. Even the rules say no such thing formally. So we act as if we've forgotten that we created the own structures that we're living into. Is there another question? And then Stephanie
Yeah.
over here.
So is objectivation an example of objectivation?
Yes, it is. Yeah. Like the strange loop, right?
Who asked that?
Glad you picked that up.
Anna.
Stephanie.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say, for an example that's coming to mind for me, the social amnesia thing is kind of like you've heard the kind of Utah legend about cutting off the ends of the ham.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And then everybody just thinks that's just what you do, but no one remembers when that was decided or under what circumstances. Yeah.
Good example. Tony.
In a way, is all language a form of objectivation?
It runs pretty deep. I don't know that I'm familiar enough with, I mean, there's probably a debate, I would imagine, in this branch of sociology. And I'm not familiar enough with that to say for sure not, but it runs pretty deep. Language, that much is clear. Tanner.
I think maybe you'll answer no to this, but does it, to be objectivation, does it have to have like terminology associated with it? Is it
Not necessarily. I mean, often that's when it happens, and it's really easy to talk about it when it happens because, pretty clear example, but not necessarily. It does. We just have to treat it like it's real. Whether we give it a formal name, that's one way to do it, but not the only way to do it. So question here as well.
Yeah, what happens to that process if they join with another group who plays the board game, but with different rules?
That's a great question. Yeah. So in those kinds of circumstances, often what happens is there starts to be breakdowns. And so these patterns, these things that we've done to create order start to get raised to the surface again. And it tends to make us kind of uncomfortable, right? So that discomfort will manifest maybe as an argument between the two families playing the board game, right? And they can't figure out why they're so heated about this. But it's based on this underlying discomfort of the order that we expect in the situation is starting to break down and we don't know what to do about it. So they have to negotiate and they go through what's called patterns of repair or repairing functions to try to come up with some way to bring back some stability and equilibrium in the way they feel about the situation. Joseph, Echo, then we'll move on to the study.
So kind of going off of what Tanner was asking, where there isn't necessarily terminology assigned to something for it to be objectivation.
Yeah.
Would that mean that a lot of like social norms that we're familiar with are a result of objectivation?
Yes. Often they are, right? They're patterns that we are treating as real in some fashion, even though it's not like gravity, right? It's not electricity. Those things don't really exist. We just act as if they're real.
Okay, we have 2 comments. The first one's from Parker, and it says, it reminds me of our discussion in 564 about prejudice. We've often assigned negative connotation to it, but in the realm of instructional design, it's not bad or good, it just is. And it's something we need to work to be aware of. And then Steve said, in psychology, we sometimes call this reifying. Is that how you say it? Yeah.
Yeah, good comments, both of you. Thank you. Okay, so this particular study, looking at objectivation in design conversations, it took place in this, I've been involved for the last about 4 years or so studying an educational simulation design team. It's based at BYU, but has been collaborating the last couple of years with other universities. So there's 8 professors involved, there's lots of students involved, and they come and go. So I don't even know if 30 is the right number anymore. It might be closer to 50 at this point. Currently, like I said, so they're based at BYU, but they're working with other universities, currently 3 total. So 2 other locations in addition to BYU, they collaborate through video conferencing. And I collected just gobs of ethnographic data. So observations and interviews and artifacts and just all kinds of things that this team has produced. And trying to figure out a way into this massive data, this big pile of data to get a handle on some of these things that are going on. This particular sample that I'm going to be sharing with you, we call it an extreme case study. Extreme means it was intentionally chosen to gather as much information about this phenomenon as possible. And so it's not representative by any means. It's not supposed to be representative. It's supposed to be at the boundaries where we can just gather lots and lots of interesting things to talk about. And so what happens in this case is the team is working on a simulation, and there's this notion of student failure that emerges. Is it good or bad for students to fail is kind of how it starts. And through this interaction, they start talking to each other and almost immediately start treating failure as an object. Whereas moments before, it was a question that they had about their own work. Okay? And so there's 4 participants in this particular conversation: Alex, Carol, Heather, and Mary. Carol is not in the room. She's on video conference. The other 3 are in the room. And I'll just play a sample of the audio, but most of the presentation, I'll just show the transcripts and talk through things that are happening in those transcripts instead of the audio directly. But I just want you to kind of get a sense of how rich these interactions are. It will play. Come on, play.
You might have to turn the speaker back over to you. Oh, wait, no.
Can they lose? So my question is,
So close, guys. We're almost there.
if they don't cut the right network, like they don't figure it out, can they lose? Because I feel like they should be able to lose.
I feel like they should be able to lose.
Yeah.
Because if there's something on the
We
line,
should all be able to, yeah. I think that's a good point, is that they should be able to.
And like, it's not like losing as in the city is now shut down.
no,
It's losing as in you didn't solve the problem, we brought someone else to solve the problem.
in the time,
Your
in
interns
the
and
time
you failed.
allotted to you, right? Maybe
Yeah.
they had 59 minutes to solve the problem. They kept trying different nodes, it didn't work, and they lost.
It's like, yeah,
I think it should be hard enough that maybe half the teams fail.
I go
Because
to,
then you can play it again. and figure
Yeah.
it out.
Okay, so there's a lot going on in that. How many seconds? 40 something seconds of conversation. How do you analyze something like that? I'm just curious what you guys think. How would you go about analyzing something like that, Tony?
I noticed the switch from using verbs to using a nominalization of the verb. So they should be able to lose
Good.
became losing.
Yes. Good, yeah. So you're doing exactly what we should be doing when we have something like this. So we have the audio, we take the transcript, but then we have to mark that transcript up using specialized notation systems to capture details that you hear, but obviously most of the time don't come through in writing. And so this is a really detailed process of slowing down the audio most of the time, like you're working with the audio at a third speed, half speed, and you try to capture things in it, and I'll blow it up so it's a bigger segment that's maybe a little easier to see. So you capture things like overlaps, right? And even though Heather at this moment interjected a yeah, Alex didn't stop talking. So it just picks up right where he left off, right? So that's another notation. Underlining things where there's extra emphasis. Capturing everything. So a lot allotted, right? So all of those little stumbles in his speech, we capture all of those. Times where they slow down their words, times where they speed up and talk faster, times where they're very, very soft or very, very loud. All of those things make a difference. And then when you analyze it, you aren't trying to derive any hidden meanings, right? You're not trying to figure out what did Alex really mean by saying this? What you're trying to figure out is what's the effect on the other people in the room? He did this. What did the other people do in response? That's how you start to go about analyzing conversations in this way. So again, so these four people are talking. I'm just going to read a little bit of the background. I'm going to try to quote a lot from the article going forward because it was really nuanced analysis. I want to make sure we get it right. So there's designing a simulation set in a city that unknown to students would shortly experience a cybersecurity attack. So it begins with students being formed into groups and given an assignment to review the city's IT infrastructure. They then work together to address any weaknesses they discover. As the meeting started, the participants began discussing the transition as consisting of two parts. Hackers first attack the city's utility billing system, and shortly after launch a new attack against the wastewater treatment facility to dump waste into the city's drinking water supply. Mary, these three are professors, by the way, and Mary's a student. So at this point, Mary says, if the first attack was meant to prepare students for the second, kind of like in a video game, you have preparatory attacks before you fight the big boss, right? And Carol then clarifies that the dual attacks were a realistic scenario a city could actually face. It's not just a convenient game mechanic, but in a real cybersecurity attack, they might do a preliminary attack first and then do the real attack second, right? Alex then summarized the proposed narrative again. Hackers would attack the billing system, partially to see if they could penetrate the network and partially to draw attention for their ultimate goal of contaminating the city's drinking water. He then verbalized the detail about the first attack that had only been implied. Students aren't able to stop that one. So the first attack against the billing system will happen no matter what the students do. But then Alex asks about the second. Students have to stop it. They fail. Right? That's the point that the analysis of our conversation began. And so the emergence of failure, the first thing the team did, they accepted student failure as a necessity and described its properties and structures as already observable facts. And Tony just alluded to this. Let me just point out a few other details of this really quickly, right? So Alex starts, my question is, if they don't cut the right network, he pauses for a moment. That's what the pause is, 1.2 seconds. Like they don't figure it out, very brief pause. Can they lose? But then he doesn't stop talking. He asked a question, but he continues on asserting, because I feel like they should be able to lose the game. Okay. So in that, what we see is Alex is not, in his lack of a pause, it probably means that the people in the room are not going to be taking it as him asking for options, right? Alex is not pausing to say, let's have a conversation about what thing we should do. He's making a rhetorical move to set up his assertion of his own opinion, essentially asking the rest of the group to agree with him, right? And that's exactly what they do, right? Heather, even before Alex finished talking, Heather agrees. I feel like they should be able to lose. Alex starts to justify himself, but he doesn't even finish because Carol jumps in and cuts him off saying, yeah, right? Some of her audio is garbled there, but we can make out the yeah, and we can see that Alex cut himself off. We should all be able to. Yeah, I think that's a good point. They should be able to. Right? So those first two steps of objectivation have already occurred seconds into the conversation, where Alex asserted something and everyone else has agreed with him. You see that? The transcript's there. What else? Oh, it was more than just saying yes, though. Like I said, we might show our agreement through other means than just by verbally assenting, right? So later in this transcript, Alex starts linking things people are saying into a structure, right? So Heather says, well, when you lose, it's not like the game is over. It just means we have to come in and bring someone else in to solve the problem. Right? And Alex says, oh, yes, there's a time limit with that too, right? And Heather agrees with that. And then suddenly Alex says, it's 59 minutes. So every time Alex is doing this, it's like adding another string to the rope, right? The whole structure is becoming more stable and more difficult for them to back out of because they've just agreed to another detail about it. And for the 59 minutes to stay true, well, of course, there has to be a time limit, right? Well, if we have a time limit, well, of course, we have to know how long that time limit is. So it's this mutually reinforcing structure of agreement that they're creating here. And they're just going on saying, yeah, 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 yeah. What do you think of this so far? Does it ring true to maybe design experiences you've been involved in? Tony?
I recognize the voice, unfortunately.
That's fine.
That's someone I've worked with.
Yeah.
Who steamrolls a little bit. And so, yeah, that rings true that you can, I've really had to learn how to assert my own opinion in conversations with.
Do you have something, Tina?
Well, just something that I noticed is that Carol, the only thing she adds to this conversation is a yeah. Even though she had a longer sentence above, there was nothing contributed. It was just that consent. And then she remained silent.
Yeah.
And I would like to, my question is, how long did she remain silent? Because you have those people in groups, right? That you're trying to gather some information as a leader,
yeah.
And they're just, and you don't know what's going on reading inside of their head.
Good. Good. Heather?
After I started seeing a lot of the yes, from my experience, my anticipation is that 59 minutes can go away in a second. That they're all agreeing because they're all trying to try on an idea. They're trying to give it the idea time to decide if it's going to live or die.
Yeah.
And so some people may be saying yeah just to give the yeah and sort of pause that says keep going because I'm not sure yet. But yeah.
That is certainly a possibility. In this particular case, that's not what happens. In this particular case, it ends up being 59 minutes. So they set their structure right. What their intent was in the end didn't matter because their yeahs allowed it to unfold this way. Any other comments or thoughts or questions? Just some other features of the conversation. They did this without deliberation, negotiation, or otherwise articulating they were the creators of what they were talking about. There's also a strong sense of momentum. They agree with each other rapidly, sometimes even interjecting agreement before another person's statement was complete. Each statement provided a foundation for the next. Further, they often sounded like they were verbalizing features of something that already existed. So the clearest example here is Alex. They kept trying different nodes. It didn't work and they lost, right? All of that is past tense. He's talking as if this is something that already exists and he's just describing a situation that has already happened. Not, hey, wouldn't it be a cool idea if we did something like this? So all of these little details, all of these little things help manifest this bias to agreement in design teams where they just acted as if they were talking about something that was already an accomplished fact. So what it accomplished, the conversation, an early articulation of how students would experience the simulation's story. There are things that happen that we would call decisions. But if you asked them, did we make a decision? There was no awareness that that's what they had done. Now we have time for maybe one more. So I'll go to the last one because the second one, interesting, but I The last one is really interesting too.
Do you think
Yes.
being in a video conference changed the way the conversation went? If they would have been in person, would have that been less of that, or do you think it would just translate to be the same? Because you can see body language more.
Yeah, you can. I mean, would it be different? Yes. How would it be different? I don't know. That's a really interesting question. In this kind of research, you try to avoid those kinds of speculations, including, I'll just kind of give a preview of one of the findings, right? Sometimes when I presented studies like this to people, they say, oh, well, yeah, that's what they did, but they were making bad decisions. Would have been better decisions if they would have followed the formal process, or if they would have done it differently, or been more intentional, or slowed down, or whatever it is. And the response to that is, how do you know that? Right? You can't judge in advance whether this was a good or bad decision. Could it have been bad? Maybe. Could it have been good? Maybe. All we really want to do is get to the bottom of what they're doing, how those interactions are really unfolding in this particular moment. Good question. Thank you, Tina. Anything else? Okay, let's look at 3 then. Skip to. Okay, so after they talk for just a couple of minutes about this idea of failure, the conversation starts to wrap up. And what they do in this transcript that you see is they're going to start describing positive results that failure had. Again, that's intentional, right? Had for students using the simulation. They're talking as if this already exists. So we go into the transcript again. Find it here. Okay, it begins where Alex summarizes a lot of the earlier conversation. Okay, but then he says, they can still figure it out. And essentially, they still have a positive learning experience. And these brackets mean that he's slowed down to emphasize positive. And this means that he held that O a little bit longer, right? So positive learning experience. He's really emphasizing that this is a good thing that students could potentially fail. Heather, it sounds like, well, it reads as if she's just adding another detail. But what it really is a form of agreement, right? Restating, they can still figure out who did it. Is a form of her way of agreeing with Alex. And Alex, in turn, then agrees back with her because they still figure out who did it, right? Carol, and her statements are always kind of funny. You would have seen that in the second, her second one. But so she says, yeah, you have to find it. Yeah, you can find out who killed somebody, right? So it's like she's alluding to a murder mystery or something like that. Like the story is not very fulfilling if you don't figure out who done it in the end, right? So she's alluding to the sense of, there's a sense of resolution. There's a benefit for students by them going through this failure process. So you save lives by giving them this chance to figure out what happened. And Mary kind of laughed at that. Alex says, everybody finds that out. Is that true? Everybody is able to locate who the person responsible is because we want some kind of happy ending. So the interesting thing in this segment of the transcript, Alex describes everybody finds that out. And then he does, what does he not ask? He does not ask, are we making a good decision? He's asking, is that true? Right? He's asking, did we factually describe the situation? Did we accurately describe the facts of the situation? And then he restated the fact. Everybody is able to locate who's the person responsible. Others already agreed with this. And even though Alex's statement there at the end is a little bit ironic, he seems to be confirming again that in some sense, failure can be a happy ending, at least comparatively speaking, because of the benefits that it could have for students learning. And so identifying the hacker in the story, that's something we saw in segment 2, is they actually identify the hacker. They don't, even if they lose, they can figure out who the hacker was, kind of post hoc. Identifying the hacker in the story was needed because of the ending it provided. Alex has indicated that the narrative must support this. It was not merely an outcome they had to accept, but it was one that they could consider desirable as well. Tina?
So then what was the failure?
So the failure is in the, excuse me, in the hack that they're investigating. So they would always fail at the first hack about the billing system, but the second hack on the wastewater, is it possible for students to fail in the simulation and not figure that out, or would the simulation be engineered to the extent that they had to figure out who perpetrated that attack? Or did they stop the attack?
Or how to stop.
Yeah, that's what the failure was. Would they stop it and succeed? Did they not stop it and fail? So it added legitimacy in this part of the conversation that student failure was a useful element of the simulation story. So these little moments of agreement, building on each other's statements, all of this built a structure that we would look back and say, well, clearly they made decisions, right? But that's us as observers putting our external representation on it again. What did it feel like to them? They're just talking. They're answering each other's questions. If you ask them, did you make decisions? They would say, well, yeah, I guess maybe. Yeah, I guess we maybe didn't make decisions. Yeah, I guess so. That's not the intent of their conversation. The intent of their conversation was to answer a question that Carol asked originally. So what are some implications of this? Well, it helps explain findings from prior research. I started the presentation by talking about in these studies of design, there's this huge bias towards agreement. And this objectivation process, I think, helps explain that, because it's a lot easier to agree with somebody when it appears that what they're doing is just describing facts that already exist, right? Than it is if they are asserting an opinion that may be controversial. By doing this objectivating process, saying, is the chair blue? Yeah, the chair is blue, right? That's really easy to agree to something like that. As opposed to, I think we should make a blue chair. And suddenly everyone has to say, whoa, wait a minute, where's that? That's kind of out of nowhere, right? We don't like blue. I think it helps explain findings from prior research, kind of like this bias to action. It provides an analytic tool to understand design team dynamics. So again, even though this process of objectivation just happens, it could be good or bad, right? And so if teams are not satisfied with what's going on, they could possibly look to, what are we doing? Are we too quickly agreeing with statements of fact? Are we hiding things we should talk about more carefully because we have so quickly just assumed they were independently existing? So design teams can use this, I think, to analyze and understand their own behavior. Further insights to the kind of logic designers employ, and this is where I'll come back to the grand question about what are design processes anyway? Well, I think what design processes are, you've seen, a lot of you have seen me use these metaphors before, right? Who are my chemists in the room? I have a chemist here. You probably know this. Is this an atom on the screen? It's not a trick question. It's not an atom. Right?
It's a diagram.
It's a diagram. Real atoms look nothing like this. They don't look like little solar systems, right? But chemistry teachers and even chemists at times find a diagram like this useful. Why? Why is it useful?
It explains things you can't see.
It draws attention to things, right, that we can't see, and helps us explain at least parts, right? Not the whole thing, but at least a little part what's going on in an atom.
Organize the information in a way that we can understand it or apply it and use it in other ways.
It helps us get our arm around something that's really, 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 really complex, especially when you're a beginner, right? So like the grad students in chemistry or the chemistry professors probably don't need this, but it was useful for me when I was in third grade, right? You've also heard me use the analogy of scales. The design processes are like scales. It's something that even if there is a progression of notes in a real concert piece, the person doesn't feel like they're playing scales, right? They feel like they're playing that piece, but practicing the scales allowed them to develop the agility, the ability to perform that. So what is a design process? I I think it's a partial but an imperfect description of what designers sometimes do. It draws attention to aspects of design practice that could be missed if we weren't paying attention to it. It provides chances to practice unfamiliar activities, right? And so those of you in 564, we practice things like problem reframing, generating lots of ideas. I'll just level with you. The best designers I know never intentionally sit down and say, let's reframe the problem now. But they're doing those kinds of things all the time. There's not a moment where they're not saying, at least tacitly, can I look at the world a little different way? What if I bent the world around this way? What if I looked at it a little differently? That's just part of their nature at this point. If it's not part of your nature, it can be useful to have a thing that we've objectified and said, look, define the problem, redefine the problem. It draws our attention and gives us a chance to practice something until it becomes second nature. So good design comes from good designers. It doesn't come from good design processes. But processes can kind of be training wheels in essence to help us become those kind of people. Hey, a couple minutes for questions. If there's anything that people are interested in. Echo?
So we have a couple of questions. One of them was from the first round of questions that you did.
Okay.
I barely missed it. So what is the relationship between objectivation and absolute truth? Because like he was saying that the objectivation does not register as like an actual word, like the autocorrect wants to change it. So is it something that you made up or?
So it's a specialized term from sociological literature. So it would be cool if I could make up something that actually stuck and other people accepted, but this wasn't it. What's the relationship between objectivation and absolute truth? Probably no relationship. I mean, objectivation is just something we do to make our interactions make sense to us. And so does that represent truth? Maybe sometimes, maybe not other times, but it allows us to do something together and allow us to feel like we are making progress in something and that we can understand each other and get by.
Somebody else asked if we could put up the slide that defines objectivation again.
Sure. So the slide that defines it is here. And I can put that up for a second, then I'll put the process up for a second in case that's what they're referring to. Screenshot. The 4 steps of that as well. Any other questions?
Maybe I'm just hung up on Alex.
Right.
I think it's interesting what this can teach about the mechanism by which certain people assert authority in a group context.
Yes, and that was just beyond the scope of the study to look at that, but Alex definitely was doing some things to assert and maintain authority. Absolutely. That's very clear as well.
And it may or may not have been coincidental that Alex was the only male in the group.
Not coincident.
Good observation. Yeah. And again, it was just beyond the scope of the study to be able to point those kinds of things out.
So what are your next steps?
Yeah. So for this particular study, we're actually moving on from studying this team, and I'm opening up some new studies at the beginning of the year. And I'll probably do this kind of analysis again to understand designers, how were they able to live in or not achieve, like, do they actually achieve their sense of quality or do they fall short of that? And this kind of detailed conversation analysis will very much be part of that study as well. So just trying to understand more these minute interactions of designers trying to figure out how do we achieve our own sense of quality? Are we living up to our own ideals or not? Is the next thing I'm interested in. If anyone's interested in being part of it, it's fun research. It's super time consuming and super detailed, but super, super fun. So if you're interested in being part of it, let me know. And I'll put up that last slide one more time if you're interested in the QR code. And other than that, thank you. That concludes seminars today. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.